It started the first week of November. My dad fell in the middle of the night. My mom found him shivering on the floor, running a fever, and she called an ambulance. When I heard the next morning, I jumped into my little red Ford Focus and made the 3-hour drive. Grateful winter hadn't arrived yet. I am absolutely terrified of driving on winter roads. I avoid it at all costs. Part of my route to my parents is through some remote highways that rarely get plowed. But off I went, meeting my mother at the hospital in my parents' small town. It was suspected my dad had an infection, and an ambulance was scheduled for him the next morning to transfer him to another city 2 hours away. I asked because I didn't really want to have to drive again, but I was told I couldn't go on the ambulance. And due to his dementia, my mother and I had to follow the ambulance because we would have to answer any questions. Driving into the city is quite normal. I take the trip several hours from my house to my parents to bring them to doctor's appointments in the city because there's not a lot of things available to them in their small town. And I usually make that trip, and we usually take my mother's car, which has all-wheel drive. But that morning, I was very worried. My mother, I knew she'd been a little stressed with things, and I knew she hadn't had an oil change for a while. So lo and behold, we jumped into my little car. Several hours later, the procedure done, we were on our way back home, and I was stopped at a very busy intersection. I was exhausted and no mood to try to fight traffic to merge. And I had just turned to my mother and said, I'm just going to wait for the light to change when, bam! Clearly, the fellow in the very large half-ton behind me had disagreed with my decision. He plowed into us, and I had been leaning forward for a chance to merge, so my head bounced forward and back. But fortunately, my mother was okay. After exchanging details, I painfully returned to the car, which thankfully was still drivable. And my mom's first words were, "Thank God that wasn't my car." Over the next several weeks, we learned my car was actually going to be written off, and insurance would cover some of the costs that in my back injury. Now, I'm a poet, so this was rife with metaphors that kept running through my head because things were really going haywire with my parents' health. And, my first question, was this a sign of what was to come? Was there a message here that I was going to have to make some really big sacrifices? How high was the price I was going to pay for this? I was injured. Would I be up for what lay ahead? And I did what I often do. I looked into my heart for some answers. I finally got past the whole woe is me thing. And I decided I was going to turn this into a win. I decided that maybe this was divine intervention, that the creator had a plan all along, thinking, girl, you're going to be on the highway a lot in the next little while. You need a better car. Fear was no longer an option. I was going to have to be where I needed to be. That settled my hub, who is cheapest person you'll ever know. He would have gladly bought back my old car, but he became obsessed with finding the right vehicle for this new reality. This small thing, when I needed him most, was one of the most loving things he's done for me in our 30 years together. He knew I was afraid, but he knew I had no choice. Over the next several months, both parents were in different hospitals for different health ailments in different cities, and it was hours of driving back and forth and back and forth. And winter did hit, and it hit hard. We've had the worst winter here we've had in years. But that little Jeep, or that new Jeep of mine, has plowed through some of the most hideous conditions I've driven in my whole life. Every single trip, I thank the creator or whoever intervened, my hub for doing what I needed when I needed him most, and my good heart for telling me it was all going to be okay. It's been a hard few months. My dad fell again and likely isn't ever coming home. My mother has decided to move him into a personal care home. And I've had to look into my heart again. That's not the decision I would make, but my heart tells me it's not my decision to make. All of this has me appreciating that man, the guy who got me the car I needed, the guy I walk beside in this life every day, even more. And I wrote this poem for him. And I want to credit the opening stanza to a few words I heard from Satoshi Yano during Michael's Write Songs You Love podcast last week, which inspired this poem, which I've called What a Heart Says. I heard something that feels like our story. You sacrifice enough, and all of a sudden it repays you. There's a beauty that can't be erased, strokes of pencil or brush, rubbing away the sting of things that didn't work out quite the way we'd planned. We are never a blank canvas, you and I. This chosen life, a wild watercolor, splashes of vibrant hues, a vigorous existence. Some days more like charcoal, pressed intensely, bleeding off the page, but light still shines through, even in the darkest corners. You are the best of me, and I am the best of you. Some of these vignettes will be tossed into our beloved bonfire so they can be forgotten, forgiven, put away for good. Others we will hang in the crevices of our willing hearts so they can wave to us when we need to hear and see them again. This is what a heart says when it has everything it needs and nowhere else it needs to be. This is what a heart says when we listen. Thank you.